I'll work forever, I swear. Just don't let them sell my sister." That's what the barefoot little girl cried, clutching the coat of a giant Apache in the snow-choked street. The men with the wagon had paper in their hands, and a toddler already inside. Folks thought it was about debt. It wasn't. Beyond the frost and the railroad smoke, there's land, rich grazing country, that men in suits will do anything to take. They've got the sheriff in their pocket, and riders on their payroll. He's a man who's buried a wife, a son, and too many promises. She's a child who'll trade her whole life for the safety of a sister who can't even speak for herself. Together, they'll ride through storms, face guns in the dark, and stand before a judge who's already been bought. Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today? And how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Fork's single muddy street as Dakota Gray Elk guided his horse between the weathered buildings. A heavily laden mule plodded behind, its back stacked with beaver and fox pelts. The bitter January wind cut through his wool coat, carrying the mingled scents of wood smoke and whiskey from the saloon. At the general store, old Thompson barely looked up as Dakota entered, the store bell's jingle mixing with the creak of floorboards. The trader's weathered hands moved quickly, sorting through the furs while Dakota stood silent, patient. His presence drew wary glances from other customers, but he paid them no mind. He'd learned long ago to let his conduct speak louder than their prejudices. "Fair-grade pelts," Thompson muttered. "I can give you 3 sacks flour, 2 pounds coffee, and enough lamp oil to last through February." Dakota nodded once. "Agreed." His deep voice was soft but carried authority earned during his Army Scout years. While Thompson measured out the supplies, Dakota's keen eyes swept the store's shelves, noting the dwindling winter provisions. It had been a harsh season for everyone. The transaction complete, he secured his purchases to the mule's pack and swung into his saddle. He'd planned to make camp before sunset, but sudden shouting from the direction of the saloon caught his attention. A crowd was gathering, their bodies tense with the particular energy that preceded trouble. Then came a child's cry. High, desperate, unmistakable. Dakota turned his horse toward the sound, years of tracking telling him something was very wrong. He saw them then. 2 men in trail-dusty clothes manhandling a small figure into their wagon. One held a toddler who thrashed and wailed, her tiny face red with tears. "Please! Somebody help!" The shout came from a girl pushing through the crowd. She was young, perhaps 9 years old, with tangled brown hair and no coat against the cold. Her feet were bare despite the freezing ground, and her face was raw from wind and weeping. She stumbled to a halt beside Dakota's horse, grabbing his coat with trembling hands. "Mister, please! They're taking Clara. I'll do anything, work forever. Just don't let them sell my sister." Dakota dismounted in one fluid motion, his height causing the nearest onlookers to step back. The 2 men at the wagon straightened, hands hovering near their gun belts. The shorter one, wire-thin with a patchy beard, spoke first. "This ain't your business, Indian." "We got papers, all legal and proper." He pulled out a folded document, waving it like a shield. "Their uncle signed over their care to cover his gambling debts. Law's on our side." "Silas and Boone Drury," someone in the crowd muttered. "Railroad fixers. Bad business, that." Dakota studied the men carefully. The quiet one, Boone, held the toddler roughly, ignoring her tears. These were men who preyed on the desperate, who'd take children to settle a debt. His jaw tightened. "The law," Dakota said clearly, "does not allow the sale of children to cover gambling losses." His Army years had taught him both territorial statutes and how to use his commanding presence. He stepped closer, noting how Silas's hand trembled slightly on his gun. "Show me a judge's order, not just a drunk man's signature." "Ain't showing you nothing," Silas spat. "Half-tame Apache trying to tell us about the law? Get lost before you get hurt." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some faces showed sympathy for the girls, others cruel amusement at the confrontation. The older girl pressed against Dakota's side, her small fingers still clutching his coat. "My name's Annie," she whispered. "Pa died last summer. Uncle James was supposed to help us keep the ranch, but he drinks and plays cards," and her voice broke. "Please don't let them take Clara. She's all I got left." Dakota placed one large hand gently on Annie's shoulder. He'd seen that same desperate look in other children's eyes during his scouting days. Young ones caught between clashing worlds, paying the price for adults' greed and failures. The memory of his own lost son tightened his chest. "The child," he said, his quiet voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "Put her down. Now." He took another step forward, letting Boone see the full measure of his height and strength. The man's eyes widened slightly. "Silas!" Boone's first words of the encounter carried uncertainty. "Shut up!" Silas snarled, but he too stepped back as Dakota advanced. A new voice cut through the tension. "What's all this, then?" The justice of the peace Murphy pushed through the crowd, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. Both sides stated their cases, Silas waving his paper while Annie sobbed out their uncle's betrayal. Throughout it all, Dakota remained still, his steady presence a counterweight to the trader's agitation. Finally, Murphy sighed, tugging at his graying mustache. "Look here, that paper's not proper custody transfer, but come morning they can file formal claim through the territorial court, unless someone with standing challenges it or shows proof of prior guardianship." He gave Dakota a meaningful look. "The law tends to favor whoever's got the paperwork, if you take my meaning." Dakota understood perfectly. By sunrise, the Drury brothers would have whatever documents they needed, bought or forged. The girls would vanish into the territories, 2 more lost children whose fate no one would question. Annie's grip on his coat tightened. "I meant what I said. I'll work forever. We got land, good grazing land. Pa left it to us. I just can't lose Clara, too." Dakota looked down at her wind-chapped face, then at little Clara, still squirming in Boone's grip. He thought of promises made and broken, of his own failures to protect those he'd loved. The cold wind carried the scent of snow coming, and with it, decision. "The children," he said to Murphy, "will stay with me tonight. You can find us at their ranch tomorrow with the proper authorities." His tone made it clear this was not a suggestion. Murphy nodded slowly, relief crossing his features. "Seems sensible. Drury, put the little one down. Everyone get inside before this weather turns worse." Boone hesitated, then set Clara on her feet. She ran to Annie, who wrapped her arms around her sister protectively. Silas opened his mouth to object, but one look at Dakota's face changed his mind. "This ain't over," he muttered, climbing onto the wagon seat. "No," Dakota agreed quietly. "It is not." Dakota led the girls and his animals off the main road, following a winding creek bed until he found a sheltered hollow about a mile outside Silver Fork. Ancient cottonwoods formed a natural windbreak, their bare branches creaking softly in the gathering dusk. He'd camped here before. The spot offered clear views of any approach while keeping firelight hidden from the road. "Stay close to the horses," he told Annie, who hadn't let go of Clara's hand since they'd left town. The older girl nodded, her face pale but determined in the fading light. Working quickly, Dakota gathered dry wood and cleared a fire pit in the snow-dusted earth. His fingers, well practiced at this task, soon had flames dancing beneath his iron cooking pot. The rich scent of venison stew began to fill the air as he added dried meat and the last of his winter vegetables to the bubbling water. Clara watched the fire with wide eyes, clinging to Annie's skirts. The toddler hadn't spoken since their rescue, but her trembling had finally stopped. Annie kept one arm around her sister while helping Dakota lay out bedrolls, her movements careful and precise despite her obvious exhaustion. "You've done this before," Dakota observed quietly. "Making camp." "Pa taught me," Annie replied, her voice catching slightly. Before last spring. Said every rancher's child should know how." She settled Clara closer to the fire's warmth, tucking a strand of the little one's hair behind her ear. He caught fever after the cattle drive. Wasn't nothing the doctor could do. Dakota stirred the stew, letting the familiar motions fill the silence that followed. When it was ready, he filled 2 tin cups for the girls. Annie helped Clara hold hers, blowing on each spoonful to cool it. "Your uncle?" Dakota said after they'd eaten some. "He took over the ranch?" Annie's face darkened. "Uncle James said he'd help us keep it running. Said Pa would have wanted that. But all he did was drink and play cards in town." She pulled Clara closer, as if trying to shield her from the memory. "Last week he lost big to those traders, Silas and Boone. They said they'd clear his debts if he signed over his rights to us and the grazing lease." Dakota's hand stilled on his coffee cup. "The grazing lease?" "Pa always said it was the best land in the county," Annie continued. 500 acres of sweet grass, with year-round water from the creek. The cattle get fat there, even in winter." Pride crept into her voice, then faded. Uncle James didn't care about that. He just wanted more drinking money. The twig snapped in the darkness beyond their fire. Dakota's hand moved to his gun belt, but the figure that emerged held empty palms up in peace. It was young Thompson, the store clerk, who'd helped measure flour that afternoon. "Easy there," the clerk said softly. "Didn't mean to startle folks." He glanced nervously over his shoulder. "Followed your tracks out here. Figured you ought to know. Them traders, they're working for the railroad." Dakota gestured for the young man to sit. "Explain." Thompson settled by the fire, accepting a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "Railroad's planning a spur line through the territory. Need water access for the steam engines and good flat land for the grade." He looked at Annie. "Your pa's grazing lease. It's perfect for what they want. They've been trying to buy up all the land rights around there for months." "That's why they want us gone," Annie whispered, "so they can take the land." Thompson nodded. "Them traders, they're fixers. Do the railroad's dirty work, getting rid of folks who won't sell." He drained his coffee quickly. "Better get back before I'm missed. Just watch yourselves. Silas and Boone, they don't fight fair." After the clerk disappeared into the darkness, snow began falling in thick, silent flakes. Dakota added more wood to the fire, watching as Annie finally succumbed to exhaustion. She lay curled around Clara, both girls sharing his heavy wool blanket. In the firelight, Dakota cleaned his Sharps rifle with practiced care. The weapon had served him well during his Army Scout days. It was accurate at long range and reliable in any weather. He had a feeling he'd need both qualities soon. His mind worked through the pieces as he oiled the rifle's action. The railroad's greed he understood. He'd seen it often enough during his scouting years. They'd use any means to get land they wanted, caring nothing for the lives they destroyed. The traders were just tools, men without honor who'd sell children to clear a debt. But the girls? Dakota watched them sleep, remembering another child lost to him years ago. His son would have been Annie's age now if the fever hadn't taken both him and Dakota's wife. The memory still ached like a badly healed wound. The snow fell harder, erasing their tracks and muffling all sound except the pop of burning wood. By morning the world would be white and clean, but Dakota knew the struggle ahead would be anything but pure. The traders would return with whatever papers they needed, caring nothing for truth or justice. His decision crystallized as he slid the cleaned rifle back into its scabbard. At first light, he'd ride for the county seat, a hard day's journey through the snow. There, he'd petition the circuit judge for guardianship of Annie and Clara. It wouldn't be easy. A former Army scout of Apache blood seeking custody of white children would raise eyebrows. But he'd seen too many young ones lost to greed and cruelty. He wouldn't let it happen again. Annie stirred in her sleep, pulling Clara closer as a cold wind swept through their camp. Dakota added another log to the fire and settled back against his saddle, rifle close at hand. The night was long and dawn would bring its own battles. But for now he kept watch, snow falling silent and steady around their small circle of warmth. The eastern sky had barely begun to lighten when Dakota rose from his watch. Frost coated his blanket, crackling as he moved. He touched Annie's shoulder gently, careful not to startle her. "Time to go, little one," he whispered. Annie woke instantly, her eyes clear despite the early hour. She cradled Clara close, keeping the toddler warm while Dakota broke camp. His hands moved swiftly in the pre-dawn darkness, packing their few supplies and saddling his horse. The mule stamped impatiently, its breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Here." Dakota handed Annie a worn wool shawl from his saddlebags. "Wrap Clara good and tight. The wind's picking up." Annie nodded, wrapping her sister in the thick fabric until only Clara's face showed. The little one barely stirred, still heavy with sleep. Dakota lifted them both onto the horse, settling Annie in the saddle before mounting behind her. Clara nestled between them, protected from the worst of the cold. They rode out just as the first gray light touched the treetops. Behind them, Dakota heard horses approaching their abandoned camp. Angry voices carried on the wind. The traders had found their cold fire pit. "Went north, looks like," one voice called out. "Tracks ain't more than an hour old." "Damn Apache scout," another voice growled. "Think he's clever, riding out before dawn." Dakota guided his horse deeper into the trees, away from the main trail. The mule followed silently, well trained from years of hunting trips. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, making tracking difficult, but it wouldn't stop determined men for long. By mid-morning, the wind had grown fierce, driving needle-sharp snow into their faces. Dakota pulled his coat collar higher, shielding Clara as best he could. The toddler whimpered softly, her small hands clutching Annie's dress. "Need to slow down," Dakota said, easing back on the reins. "Horse and mule are working too hard in this snow." He'd seen too many good animals foundered by pushing too fast in winter weather. They followed a shallow valley, using the terrain for shelter from the wind. When they crossed a frozen creek around noon, Dakota noticed Clara's teeth chattering. He pulled up immediately, scanning the area before choosing a spot beneath a rocky overhang. "Her feet are too cold," Annie said worriedly, as Dakota helped them dismount. "She won't say nothing, but I can feel her shaking." Dakota worked quickly, gathering dry branches from beneath the snow. Soon, a small fire burned in the shelter of the rocks. He sat Clara close to the flames, rubbing her tiny feet between his large hands until color returned to them. Annie helped feed both animals a measure of grain, her movements efficient despite her own obvious cold. As they rested, Dakota studied the telegraph poles marching along the distant ridge line. He could send word ahead to the county judge, warn him they were coming, maybe even request protection. But he'd seen too many telegraph operators bought off during his army days. Any message they sent would likely reach the traders before it reached the judge. The sun was low when they finally approached the pine forest Dakota remembered from his trapping days. The old lean-to still stood, half hidden among the trees, a simple shelter of logs and bark, but better than sleeping in the open. "Almost there," he told Annie, who had been fighting sleep for the last hour. "Just need to—" The thunder of hoofbeats cut him off. Dakota reined up sharply, pulling their horse behind a thick stand of pines. 3 riders passed below them on the road, moving fast despite the failing light. Even in the dusk, Dakota recognized the way they sat their horses. Hired guns, the kind that followed money and asked no questions. Annie's eyes went wide with fear. Dakota pressed one finger to his lips, holding them motionless until the sounds faded into the distance. Clara, sensing the tension, stayed perfectly quiet in her sister's arms. "They're hunting us," Annie whispered once the riders were gone, "like Pa used to hunt wolves." Dakota nodded grimly. "But we have something those wolves didn't. Shelter they don't know about and knowledge of where we're going." He led them carefully through the deepening shadows to the lean-to. "We'll rest here tonight. Those men will ride right past looking for our fire." The old shelter was crude but sound, its bark roof still keeping out the worst of the weather. Dakota spread their blankets in the driest corner, while Annie settled Clara on a bed of pine boughs. They ate cold jerky and hard biscuits. No fire tonight, not with hunters so close. As darkness settled over the forest, snow began falling again. It would cover their tracks, Dakota knew, but it would also slow their journey tomorrow. He watched Annie curl protectively around her sleeping sister, both girls exhausted from the long day's ride. The night ahead would be cold and long, but they were safer here than on the open road. Dakota checked his rifle one last time before taking up his watch position near the shelter's entrance. The traders and their hired guns might be hunting them, but they would find that tracking an Apache scout through winter forest was no easy task. The pale winter sun had barely cleared the horizon when Dakota roused the girls. Frost sparkled on the lean-to's bark roof, and their breath hung in white clouds as they packed their few belongings. Clara fussed quietly until Annie shared the last of their hard biscuits with her. "The snow's stopped," Annie observed, helping Dakota secure their packs to the mule's harness. Her small fingers worked the leather straps with growing confidence. "Yes, but the road will be treacherous." Dakota tested the ice-crusted snow with his boot. "We'll need to take it slow, especially on the downslopes." They set out as the morning light strengthened, following a narrow trail that wound through the pines. The horse picked its way carefully across the frozen ground, hooves crunching through the icy crust. Clara dozed against Annie's chest, wrapped snugly in the wool shawl. By midday, the path opened into a sheltered valley where smoke rose from several small adobe houses. Fields of stubbled corn stretched beneath the snow, and horses grazed on hay spread near rough-built corrals. Dakota straightened in his saddle as an elderly Apache man emerged from the largest dwelling. "Red Willow," Dakota called out in Apache, raising his hand in greeting. "I seek shelter for these little ones." The elder's weathered face creased in a smile as he approached. His black hair was streaked with gray, and he walked with the measured step of one who had lived long on the land. "Dakota Gray Elk," he replied warmly. "It has been many moons since you passed this way." Women appeared from other houses, curious about the visitors. One carried a steaming pot toward a cooking shelter, and the smell of rich stew made Annie's stomach growl audibly. Red Willow chuckled at the sound. "Come," he said, switching to English for the girls' benefit. "Share our meal and tell us what brings you here with these young ones." Inside the cooking shelter they sat on woven mats while a woman ladled thick stew into wooden bowls. Clara watched wide-eyed as another woman ground corn on a stone matat, the rhythmic scraping a soothing backdrop to their conversation. Dakota explained their situation as they ate: the girl's father's death, their uncle's gambling, the trader's scheme to claim their grazing lease. Red Willow's expression grew grave. "The railroad's shadow falls long across our lands," the elder said, stirring his stew thoughtfully. "Their money speaks loudly in the white man's courts, even at the county seat." He glanced at the girls. "But these children's claim to their father's land is just, we will help as we can." Annie, who had been listening intently, set down her empty bowl. "Thank you," she said carefully in Apache, the words unpracticed but sincere. The women nearby smiled warmly at her effort, and one reached out to smooth Clara's tangled hair. Red Willow nodded approvingly. "We can offer you a fresh horse in trade for your mule," he told Dakota, "and dried corn for your journey. The horse is younger, better suited for hard riding if it comes to that." "Much obliged," Dakota replied, knowing the offer was generous. The mule was trail-weary, and fresh mounts might make the difference if the traders caught up to them. As evening approached, the settlement's women showed Annie how to wrap Clara in a traditional cradleboard. They demonstrated how the sturdy frame would protect the toddler and make her easier to carry, whether on horseback or on foot. Clara fussed at first, but soon settled into the snug wrapping, her eyes heavy with sleep. "See how she rests better?" One woman showed Annie how to adjust the straps. "Our mothers have carried babies this way since the old times." Annie traced the painted designs on the cradleboard's edges. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "like a safe little nest for her." Dakota watched the exchange from where he sat mending a torn saddle strap. The sight of Annie learning from the Apache women stirred something in his chest. Hope, perhaps, that bridges could still be built between peoples despite all the barriers that existed. Red Willow's daughter insisted they sleep in her house that night, laying fresh blankets on the packed earth floor near the hearth. Dakota positioned himself near the door, his Sharp's rifle within easy reach. Though he trusted the settlement's safety, years of caution had taught him to stay prepared. The house's thick adobe walls kept out the bitter wind, and the fire's warmth soon had both girls sleeping deeply. Dakota realized it was the first time in weeks he'd slept under a proper roof. Still, his rest was light, his warrior's instincts alert to any unusual sound. Hours before dawn, Red Willow's quiet voice roused him. The elder's face was grave in the dying firelight. "Our scouts saw riders approaching from the west," he murmured in Apache. "3 men, moving fast despite the dark. They asked questions at every settlement." Dakota was on his feet instantly, gathering their belongings. "The traders hired guns," he said grimly. "We must go before they reach here." Red Willow nodded. "The horse is ready. We've packed food for your journey." He pressed a small pouch into Dakota's hand. "Medicine, if the little one takes fever. Go with our prayers." Annie woke quickly when Dakota touched her shoulder, helping to wrap Clara securely in the new cradle board without waking her. The settlement's women had already packed their supplies onto the fresh horse, a sturdy bay gelding that stood quietly as Dakota checked its tack. The eastern sky was still dark as they prepared to leave. Red Willow and several others gathered to bid them farewell, speaking soft blessings in Apache. Annie surprised them all by responding with the traditional words of gratitude, carefully pronounced. "You have a good heart, little one," Red Willow told her. "May it stay strong through what lies ahead." Dakota led them away from the settlement as the stars still glimmered overhead. Rather than follow the main road south, he guided their horse onto a narrow trail that wound up toward a rocky ridge. The fresh bay gelding proved its worth immediately, picking its way sure-footed over the rough terrain despite the dim light. "Won't the traders follow us up here?" Annie whispered, holding Clara secure in her new cradle board. "They might try," Dakota replied, scanning the shadowy landscape below. "But this trail is harder to track, and we can see anyone coming from up high." As dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold, they gained enough elevation to look out over miles of snow-covered country. The main road curved like a dark ribbon through the valley they'd left behind. Annie gasped softly at the view. "It's like being on top of the whole world," she said, her breath frosting in the crisp air. Dakota nodded. "The high ground gives us advantage. We'll move slower but safer." The morning warmed slightly as they followed the ridgeline south. By mid-morning, Dakota called a halt in a protected hollow where stunted pines offered some shelter. While the horse rested, he showed Annie how to set small wire snares along rabbit trails in the snow. "Watch how I bend the wire," he demonstrated, his large hands working carefully. "The loop must be just so, and set at the right height for a rabbit to run through." Annie's first attempts twisted awkwardly, but she kept trying until she had set 3 snares properly. Her face glowed with pride when Dakota nodded approval. "Papa taught me about tracking rabbits," she said quietly, "but never how to catch them like this." "Your father taught you well," Dakota replied. "A good hunter first learns to read signs." They continued along the ridge as clouds began building in the west. The wind picked up steadily, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. Clara, who had been dozing, woke when they stopped to check the snares. Annie helped her sister stand in the snow, while Dakota retrieved a plump rabbit from one of the traps. Clara toddled over to another snare, reaching for something that had caught her eye. She giggled delightedly when she discovered it was just snow caught on the wire, clumping like white fur on her mittened hand. "Look, Annie!" she called, one of her rare clear words. "Snow bunny!" Annie laughed too, the sound bright against the rising wind. "That's right, Clara. You caught a snow bunny." Dakota watched the sister's moment of joy, his weathered face softening. But the darkening sky soon had them moving again, searching for better shelter before the storm hit. As dusk approached, they came upon an old line shack tucked against a cliff face. The rough-built cabin had clearly been abandoned for some time, but its log walls still stood strong against the wind. Dakota circled it carefully before leading them inside. "It's not much," he said, brushing cobwebs from the single window, "but it's solid. We can wait out the storm here." While Annie got Clara settled on a musty bunk, Dakota went back outside to check their surroundings more thoroughly. The fading light revealed what he'd feared, tracks in the snow showing where riders had followed their trail partway up the ridge. But the tracks turned back before reaching this height, apparently unwilling to risk the steeper terrain and gathering darkness. Inside he found Annie had managed to start a small fire in the crude stone fireplace, using dry kindling from a corner stack. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Dakota prepared the rabbit for cooking. "Someone followed us," Annie asked quietly, reading his expression. "They turned back," he assured her. "We're safe here for tonight." They ate the rabbit stew in comfortable silence, all three hungry after the long day's ride. Clara fell asleep quickly, still secure in her cradleboard. Annie helped Dakota lay out their blankets near the fire before curling up beside her sister. Hours later, Dakota woke to soft crying. Annie sat upright in her blankets, tears streaming down her face in the dim firelight. "I saw them taking her," she whispered when Dakota moved closer. "In my dream, they grabbed Clara, and I couldn't hold on tight enough." "Just a dream," Dakota said gently. "See? She's right here, safe beside you." Annie wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know I should be braver." "Being brave doesn't mean never being afraid," Dakota said. "It means going on anyway." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "I had a son once, about Clara's age." Annie looked up at him. "What happened to him?" "Fever took him and his mother 3 winters ago." Dakota's voice grew distant with memory. "For a long time I had dreams of holding him, only to wake and find my arms empty." "Does it still hurt?" Annie asked softly. "Yes, but differently now." Dakota stirred the fire's embers. "I've learned to carry them in my heart instead of my arms." The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's single window. Clara stirred but didn't wake. Dakota reached for his medicine pouch and drew out a small wooden cross that hung alongside traditional Apache tokens. "I pray for them still," he said. "In both languages, I know. Would you like to pray with me?" Annie nodded, drawing her blanket closer around her shoulders. Dakota's deep voice filled the cabin, first in Apache, the words flowing like water over stones. Then he switched to English, his accent stronger as he prayed. "Great Spirit, watch over these little ones as you watch over my own. Guard their sleep, guide our path, grant us wisdom to keep them safe." The familiar rhythm of prayer seemed to ease something in Annie's shoulders. She leaned against the rough wall, her eyes growing heavy as Dakota's words continued, weaving English and Apache together in a soothing cadence that spoke of protection and peace. When he finished, Annie was nearly asleep again. "Thank you," she murmured as he helped her lie back down beside Clara. "Rest now, little one," Dakota said softly. "I'll keep watch." He settled near the door with his rifle across his knees, listening to the storm rage outside while the girls slept peacefully in the firelight's warm glow. Their trust in him felt both precious and weighty, a responsibility he hadn't sought but now wouldn't abandon for anything in this world. 3 more days passed in a blur of snow-covered hills and careful progress. The ridge trail eventually led them down to rolling prairie, where scattered homesteads dotted the landscape. Late afternoon sun glinted off fresh snow as Dakota spotted smoke rising from a modest cabin's chimney. A well-worn path led to the homestead, where several goats grazed on hay spread over the snow. As they approached, a woman emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand. She was sturdy-built and middle-aged, with silver threading through her dark hair. "That's far enough," she called out, though her tone held more caution than threat. Dakota reined his horse to a stop, keeping his hands visible. "We mean no harm, ma'am. Just travelers seeking shelter from the cold." The woman's eyes fell on Annie and Clara, taking in their worn clothes and tired faces. Her expression softened immediately. Well, now that's a different matter." She lowered her rifle. "I'm Martha Kane, and those little ones look like they could use a proper meal." "Much obliged," Dakota said. "I'm Dakota Gray Elk. This is Annie and her sister Clara." Martha propped her rifle against the cabin wall and bustled them inside. The interior was small but tidy, warmed by a pot-bellied stove and smelling of fresh-baked cornbread. Clara's eyes widened at the sight of a real table with chairs. "Sit yourselves down," Martha urged, already pouring coffee into tin cups, the cornbread still warm. Annie helped Clara onto a chair while Dakota remained standing near the door, respectfully removing his hat. Martha cut thick slices of golden cornbread and set out a crock of butter. "Been a while since I had young ones at my table," she said, watching the girls eat. "Not since my John passed and the boys grew up and moved on." She poured more coffee. "What brings you out in such weather?" Dakota explained their situation carefully, measuring Martha's reactions. When he mentioned the traders and their connection to the railroad, her face darkened. "Those vultures," she muttered, "been trying to buy up every piece of land they can lay hands on." She turned to Annie. "Your pa was James Morton, wasn't he? I remember him from church socials years back." Annie nodded, surprise crossing her face. "Thought so. You've got his look about you." Martha refilled their plates. "You'll stay the night, of course. Got a proper bed up in the loft where the girls can sleep warm." Later, while Annie helped Clara wash up, Dakota stepped outside to tend to his horse. Martha followed, carrying a measure of oats. "For your mount," she said, then added more quietly, "Reckon you should know. Sheriff Cray's deep in the railroad's pocket. Won't get fair hearing from him, especially not—" She hesitated. "Especially not for an Apache," Dakota finished evenly. Martha nodded. "But there might be another way." She glanced to ensure the girls couldn't hear. "Law says closest kin has first right of guardianship, even above an uncle's debt claim, if they're willing to step forward." Dakota considered this. "These girls have other family?" "Their father's cousin, Lillian Hart, runs a small ranch about half a day's ride east." Martha's eyes held a calculating look. "She's a widow, keeps to herself mostly. But she's good people, and she'd have legal standing, especially if she was married to someone willing to help protect those girls." The meaning of her words settled heavily in the cold air between them. "A marriage of convenience," Dakota said slowly, "might be the only way to block those traders' claim legal-like." Martha shrugged. "Just something to consider." Inside, they could hear Clara's delighted giggle as Annie helped her into a clean nightgown Martha had found, one left from her own children's younger days. The sound seemed to underscore the stakes of their situation. That evening, after the girls were tucked into the loft bed, Dakota sat at Martha's table cleaning his rifle while she darned socks by lamplight. The familiar motions of maintaining his weapon helped him think. "This Lillian Hart," he said finally. "What kind of woman is she?" Martha didn't look up from her mending. "Practical sort. Works hard, keeps her word. Lost her husband 2 years back in a fall from a horse. Been running the ranch alone since then." She tied off a thread. "Hasn't been easy for her, but she's managing. Might welcome some help if it came with honest intentions." Dakota reassembled his rifle with careful movements. "Would she consider such an arrangement? With someone like me?" "Lillian judges folks by their actions, not their bloodlines." Martha set her mending aside. "And from what I've seen of how you've protected those girls, your actions speak plenty clear." Above them, Clara murmured in her sleep. They could hear Annie softly humming the same lullaby Dakota had heard her use during their nights on the trail. "First real roof they've had in weeks," Martha observed, They deserve a proper home." Dakota nodded slowly. The weight of the decision pressed on him like physical thing. A marriage of convenience wasn't what he'd imagined when he'd sworn to protect the girls. But perhaps Martha was right. It might be the only way to ensure their safety through legal channels. "I'll think on it," he said finally. Martha stood and banked the stove for the night. "Get some rest. You can take the side room, been empty since my youngest moved to Kansas City." She paused at the bottom of the loft stairs. "Whatever you decide, you're welcome to stay tomorrow. Storm's coming anyway, by my bones reckoning." Later, lying on a real mattress for the first time in months, Dakota listened to the wind picking up outside. The girls' soft breathing drifted down from the loft, peaceful in their exhausted sleep. Tomorrow he would need to make a choice, continue their desperate flight, or consider Martha's suggestion of an unconventional solution. For now, though, they were safe and warm, and that was enough for one night. Dakota closed his eyes, his last thoughts dwelling on Martha's description of Lillian Hart. A practical woman who judged by actions rather than bloodlines. Perhaps he reflected as sleep finally claimed him. There was hope in that. Morning painted the sky in streaks of pink and gold, casting long shadows across Martha Kane's frost-covered yard. The air held that special winter clarity that made every breath sharp and clean. Inside the cabin, the smell of coffee and frying salt pork drew Annie and Clara down from the loft, their hair tousled from sleep. Martha had already been up for hours, feeding her goats and preparing a hearty breakfast. "Can't send you off without proper food in your bellies," she insisted, sliding corn cakes onto their plates. Annie helped Clara cut her portions into small bites while Dakota saddled the horses. When he returned, Martha pressed a wrapped bundle into his hands. Extra cornbread and dried apple slices for the road. The sun climbed higher as they bid Martha farewell, their horses' hooves crunching through the crusty snow. She'd given them clear directions to Lillian Hart's ranch. Follow the creek east until they reached a stand of cottonwoods, then north past the old mission bell. Clara rode secure in front of Dakota, wrapped warm in one of Martha's old blankets. Annie sat straight on the fresh horse Red Willow had provided, her eyes scanning the horizon as Martha had taught her, watching for weather changes. By midday they passed the broken mission bell, its wooden tower weathered gray with age. The land opened up into rolling pasture, dotted with cattle huddled against the cold. A well-maintained split-rail fence marked the boundary of Lillian Hart's property. They followed the fence line to a modest ranch house, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A woman emerged onto the porch at the sound of their approach. She wore a practical dark skirt and wool jacket, her brown hair swept back in a simple knot. Though barely 35, her face showed the weathering of someone who worked outdoors in all seasons. "Mrs. Hart?" Dakota called from horseback, keeping a respectful distance. She stepped forward, one hand resting on a porch post. "That's right, and you are?" Dakota Gray Elk. "Martha Kane directed us here." He gestured to the girls. "This is Annie Parker and her sister Clara. We need to speak with you about an urgent matter." Lillian's eyes moved from Dakota to the girls, taking in their trail-worn appearance. After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "Stable your horses first. You look like you've ridden far. We can talk inside where it's warm." The barn was neat and well kept, smelling of fresh hay and leather. While Dakota tended to the horses, Lillian led the girls inside. By the time he joined them, they were seated at her kitchen table with cups of hot tea. "Martha mentioned you might come," Lillian said, pouring another cup for Dakota. "Said it was about these girls' guardianship." Dakota explained their situation, the girls' father's death, their uncle's gambling, the trader's corrupt claim, and the railroad's interest in their land. Lillian listened without interruption, her expression growing grave. "Those railroad men tried buying my south pasture last spring," she said when he finished, "offered 3 times its worth. When I refused, they found ways to make things difficult. Cattle scattered, fences cut." She looked at Annie and Clara with understanding. "Martha suggested marriage as a solution?" "Yes, ma'am. Dakota replied carefully. A legal arrangement only to secure guardianship through your family connection. Lillian studied him, her gaze direct. You understand what you're asking? Even a marriage in name only is a serious commitment in the eyes of the law and the Lord. I do understand. Dakota met her eyes steadily. These girls need protection I can't provide alone. I'm willing to make whatever honorable arrangement necessary to ensure their safety. Annie watched this exchange with worried eyes, clutching Clara's hand under the table. Lillian noticed and softened her expression. Why don't you girls help me gather eggs while Mr. Gray Elk and I discuss details? She suggested. From a shelf she retrieved an old rag doll, faded but clean. Clara might like to hold Sally here while we work. Clara's face lit up at the sight of the doll. Even Annie managed a small smile as they followed Lillian to the henhouse. When they returned, rosy-cheeked from the cold, Lillian had made her decision. If Reverend Matthews agrees to perform the ceremony, I'll do it, she said. These girls deserve a proper home, and I won't see them handed over to those traitors. Relief washed over Annie's face. Clara, oblivious to the adult concerns, happily played with Sally the rag doll in a patch of late afternoon sunlight. As evening approached, Lillian bustled around her kitchen, preparing a simple but filling supper of bean soup and fresh bread. The lamp cast a warm glow over the scene. Annie helping Clara feed Sally make-believe spoonfuls of soup, Dakota and Lillian discussing practical matters of ranch management and the girls' schooling. The trading post school's only 3 miles away, Lillian noted. Annie could ride there come spring, and Clara's not too young to learn her letters. Dakota watched the girls play, feeling some of the tension ease from his shoulders for the first time in weeks. The arrangement wasn't what he'd expected when he'd first encountered Annie's desperate plea in Silver Fork, but perhaps they'd found their answer here in Lillian's warm kitchen. When supper was finished and the dishes washed, Lillian showed the girls to a small bedroom off the main room. It was my sister's room when she stayed here, she explained, helping Clara into a borrowed nightgown. You two can share it for now. Dakota gathered his bedroll and rifle. I'll sleep in the barn, he said firmly when Lillian started to protest. It's proper, until vows are spoken. Lillian nodded, respecting his sense of propriety. There's fresh hay in the loft. I'll wake you at first light. We should ride to town early, speak to Reverend Matthews before those traders catch our trail. The barn was cold, but clean, the horses contentedly munching hay below. Dakota climbed to the loft and arranged his bedroll, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, cattle lowing softly in the distance, an owl's questioning call, the creak of the windmill turning slowly in the evening breeze. Through the barn's window he could see lamplight still glowing in the ranch house kitchen. The sight stirred memories of his own home, long ago, before illness took his wife and son. He pushed the thoughts aside. This arrangement with Lillian wasn't about rekindling such dreams. It was about protecting 2 young girls who needed help. Still, as sleep began to claim him, Dakota found himself offering silent thanks for Martha Kane's wisdom, for Lillian Hart's practical kindness, and for the way Providence sometimes worked through unexpected channels to provide exactly what was needed. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds, as Dakota helped Annie and Clara into Lillian's wagon. The morning air bit sharp and clean, promising another cold winter day. Lillian handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding her team of sturdy draft horses toward the village of Copper Creek, 3 miles distant. Reverend Price usually stays at the mission house when he's making his circuit rounds, Lillian explained, adjusting her shawl against the wind. He's been serving these parts for near 20 years now. Clara dozed against Annie's shoulder, wrapped snug in a quilt. Dakota rode alongside on his horse, scanning the road ahead from habit. The village appeared through the morning mist, a cluster of wooden buildings around a crossroads, anchored by a white clapboard church with a modest steeple. As they pulled up to the mission house, an elderly man in a black coat emerged, his silver hair catching the morning light. His weathered face creased into a smile of recognition. "Well, if it isn't Dakota Gray Elk," he called out, stepping carefully down the wooden steps. "Last time I saw you was at Fort Laramie, must be 6 years back." Dakota dismounted, extending his hand. "Reverend Price, didn't expect you'd remember." "Remember? How could I forget the scout who guided us through that blizzard?" The old preacher clasped Dakota's hand warmly. "You saved half my congregation that day." Lillian helped the girls down from the wagon while Dakota made introductions. Reverend Price listened intently to their situation, his kind eyes taking in Annie's worried face and Clara's sleepy confusion. "Marriage for the children's protection, you say?" He nodded slowly. "Come inside, all of you. Mrs. Miller next door just made fresh coffee, and this deserves proper discussion." The mission house parlor was modest but welcoming, warmed by a pot-bellied stove. While Clara played quietly with wooden blocks in the corner, they explained the full circumstance to Reverend Price, the trader's false claim, the railroad's schemes, and their need for legal guardianship. "I've heard talk of these railroad men," the Reverend said gravely, "causing trouble up and down the territory." He turned to Lillian. "You understand this marriage would be binding in the eyes of both law and God?" "I do," Lillian replied steadily. "These girls are my kin, however distant. I aim to protect them." Reverend Price studied Dakota. "And you, my friend? This is no small commitment." "I gave my word to keep them safe," Dakota said simply. "I mean to honor that promise." The old preacher smiled. "Then I'll perform the ceremony this afternoon." He glanced at Lillian's practical riding dress. "Though you might want something more fitting for a bride, my dear." "Sarah Miller might have something that would do," Lillian mused. "She's about my size." They spent the morning making preparations. Mrs. Miller, the neighbor, not only loaned Lillian a dove-gray dress, but insisted on helping her arrange her hair. Annie helped Clara wash her face and smooth her dress, while Dakota cleaned his best shirt and borrowed a dark wool coat from the Reverend. By 3 o'clock, soft lamplight filled the little church. Mrs. Miller had brought fresh pine boughs to deck the plain wooden walls, their fresh scent mixing with lamp oil and old hymnals. Annie sat in the front pew, holding Clara in her lap, their faces glowing with hope. Dakota stood before the altar, his tall frame straight and dignified in the borrowed coat. When Lillian entered, wearing Sarah Miller's gray dress and carrying a small bouquet of dried winter roses, he felt his breath catch. She moved with quiet grace, her eyes meeting his with calm assurance as she took her place beside him. Reverend Price's voice filled the small space, reading the familiar words of the marriage service. Sunlight slanted through the western windows, catching the silver in his hair as he spoke of duty, honor, and God's blessing on those who shelter the orphan. "Do you, Dakota Gray Elk, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was deep and certain. "And do you, Lillian Hart, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Clear and unwavering. They exchanged simple gold bands borrowed from the Reverend's collection of donated jewelry. As they spoke their vows, Annie wiped tears from her cheeks, smiling. Clara, not fully understanding but caught up in the moment's solemnity, sat unusually still. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Price concluded, "I now pronounce you man and wife." There was no kiss. This was a marriage of convenience and protection. But Dakota and Lillian's hands clasped briefly, sealing their commitment to their shared purpose. The small party returned to Lillian's ranch house through softly falling snow. Mrs. Miller had insisted on sending along a pot of her famous venison stew and a basket of fresh cornbread. The kitchen filled with warmth and savory aromas as they gathered around the table. Annie helped Lillian serve while Clara carefully arranged spoons at each place. For the first time in weeks, conversation flowed easily, punctuated by genuine laughter. Reverend Price shared stories of his circuit-riding adventures, making even Clara giggle with his tale of mistaking a young bear for a wayward sheep. To family, Lillian proposed, raising her coffee cup, however it comes to us. To family, they echoed, and Dakota felt something shift in his heart. Since losing his wife and son, he'd kept himself apart, trading and traveling alone. But here, watching Annie help Clara break her cornbread, seeing Lillian's quiet smile across the table, he felt the walls around his grief begin to soften. Outside, snow continued to fall, dusting the ranch in pristine white. Inside, lamplight gleamed on the worn wooden table, catching the simple gold bands on Dakota and Lillian's fingers. It wasn't a conventional family they'd created, but perhaps it was exactly what each of them needed. The evening passed in peaceful domesticity. Annie helped clear the dishes while Clara dozed in Lillian's old rocking chair. As darkness settled over the ranch, Dakota stepped onto the porch to check the stock one last time. The snow had stopped, leaving the world hushed and clean beneath a rising moon. For the first time in years, he felt the stirring of belonging, not just to a place, but to people who needed him, who he needed in return. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself, but standing there in the quiet night, watching the lamplight spill from Lillian's windows, he felt a deep sense of rightness settle over him. Dawn crept over Lillian's ranch in ribbons of pale gold and rose. Frost etched delicate patterns on the window panes, and wisps of wood smoke curled from the chimney into the crisp morning air. Inside, Annie helped Clara button her wool dress while Lillian stirred a pot of steaming oatmeal. Dakota had already been out to tend the stock, his footprints marking fresh tracks in the snow. The peaceful morning shattered at the sound of approaching hoofbeats. 2 riders appeared through the morning mist, badges glinting on their coats. Dakota straightened from where he'd been stacking firewood, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt. "Morning, folks," the first deputy called out, reining his horse to a stop. "Got some official business to attend to." Lillian appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "What kind of business?" The second deputy, a younger man with cold eyes, produced a folded paper. Arrest warrant for Reverend Samuel Price, charged with performing a fraudulent marriage ceremony without proper posting of banns. Annie pressed closer to Lillian, holding Clara's hand tight. Dakota remained motionless, watching. "That's nonsense," Lillian protested. "Reverend Price has married folks here for 20 years. He knows the law." "Sheriff Cray says different." The first deputy smirked. "Speaking of which, he's on his way to sort out this whole situation." As if summoned by the words, another horse and wagon appeared on the road. Sheriff Amos Cray sat tall in his saddle, looking pleased with himself as he approached. The trading brothers, Silas and Boone Drury, flanked him like dark shadows. "Mrs. Hart," the sheriff said, touching his hat brim with false courtesy. "Or should I say Mrs. Gray Elk? Though that ain't legal now, is it?" "What do you want, Sheriff?" Dakota's voice was low, but carried clearly in the morning air. "Way I see it, with no legal marriage, there's no legal guardianship." Cray swung down from his horse. "Which means these girls are wards of the county until a proper hearing can be held." "No!" Annie cried out, clutching Clara closer. "You can't do this!" Lillian stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "These girls are my kin." "Distant kin," Silas Drury cut in smoothly. "And with your involvement in this fraudulent marriage scheme, well, Sheriff, wouldn't that make her an unfit guardian?" Cray nodded, clearly enjoying himself. "Could be charged as conspiracy to circumvent the law. Mighty serious offense." "You're twisting the law to serve the railroad," Dakota said, his voice tight with controlled fury. The sheriff's hand dropped to his gun. "Careful now, Gray Elk. Man like you threatening a lawman, that's hanging offense in these parts." Boone Drury moved toward the house, his heavy boots crunching in the snow. "Come along, girls. Time to go with the sheriff." Annie backed away, tears streaming down her face. Clara began to wail, clinging to her sister's skirts. Lillian tried to step between them, but the younger deputy grabbed her arm. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he warned. "Please!" Annie sobbed as Boone reached for them. "Dakota, help us!" Dakota took one step forward, but froze as both deputies drew their guns. The sheriff's voice cut through the morning air like a whip. "One more move, and you'll hang before sunset. Stand down." Helpless rage burned in Dakota's chest as he watched Boone lift both crying girls into the wagon. Clara reached out with small hands, calling his name between sobs. Annie's face was a mask of betrayal and terror. "The hearing will be held day after tomorrow," Cray announced, mounting up. "Though I expect the judge will see things clear enough. These girls need proper Christian guardians, not some—" He paused, looking Dakota up and down with contempt. "Irregular arrangement. This isn't justice," Lillian's voice shook with fury. "This is theft, plain and simple." "Keep talking like that, Mrs. Hart, and you'll face charges yourself." The sheriff gathered his reins. "Best remember your place." The wagon wheels crunched through the snow as it turned, carrying the girls away. Annie's cries grew fainter as the distance grew. Clara's wailing cut through the morning air like a knife. Dakota stood rigid, every muscle straining against the need to act. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles white with the effort of restraint. The deputies kept their guns trained on him until they backed their horses away. The sound of hoofbeats and wagon wheels faded into silence. Only then did Dakota's control break. He slammed his fist into the nearest fence post, splintering the wood. A sound rose from his chest, part growl, part cry of anguish. Lillian sank to her knees in the snow, shoulders shaking. "Those poor girls," she whispered. "What they must think of us, standing here doing nothing while they were taken." Dakota stared down the empty road where the wagon had disappeared, carrying away 2 children he'd sworn to protect. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trampled snow, and the silence pressed in around them like a physical weight. The law that should have protected the innocent had become a weapon in corrupt hands. The marriage that should have saved them had instead given their enemies the very tool needed to tear the girls away. The helplessness of it all burned like poison in his veins. But beneath the fury and shame, something else stirred, a cold, clear certainty. The law had failed them, but he had made a promise. And Dakota Gray Elk kept his promises, no matter the cost. The winter sun crawled across the sky as Dakota paced the length of Lillian's barn. Each step stirred up wisps of hay dust that danced in the shafts of light streaming through the weathered boards. His boots traced the same path over and over, like a caged mountain lion. Outside, the temperature dropped as afternoon faded into evening, but he barely noticed the cold. Lillian brought him coffee and bread at midday, her own face drawn with worry. "You need to eat something," she insisted, pressing the tin cup into his hands. The coffee had long since gone cold, untouched on the rough-hewn shelf where he'd set it. As dusk approached, heavy clouds rolled in from the west, promising more snow. Dakota pulled his coat tighter and stepped out into the gathering darkness. The air held that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm, muffling even the crunch of his boots in the old snow. "I'm going to check on them," he told Lillian, who stood in her doorway with a lamp. "Be careful," she warned softly. "The sheriff's men will be watching." Dakota moved like a shadow through the empty streets of the small town. Years of scouting had taught him how to stay unseen, how to place each foot silently, even on frozen ground. The jailhouse sat at the end of the main street, its windows glowing yellow against the night. He kept to the deeper shadows between buildings, working his way closer. The jail was a squat building of rough-cut stone, with iron bars set into small windows. Light spilled out in rectangular patches on the snow, and through one window Dakota could see the deputy's boots propped up on a desk. The man appeared to be dozing. Moving carefully around the corner, Dakota found what he was looking for. In the window of the cell, a small figure stood holding an even smaller one. Annie's face pressed close to the bars, Clara bundled against her chest in a worn blanket. The toddler appeared to be sleeping, but Annie's eyes were wide open, scanning the darkness. When she spotted Dakota's shape in the shadows, her whole body tensed. He raised one finger to his lips, though the gesture wasn't needed. Annie had learned caution the hard way these past months. She gave the slightest nod to show she understood. In the dim light, her lips moved silently, forming words that struck him like physical blows. Don't let them sell her. The same plea that had started all this, back in that mining town that felt a lifetime ago. The same desperate trust in her eyes, the same fierce protection of her sister. Dakota's jaw clenched until his teeth ached. He touched his chest with his open palm, a promise without words, then melted back into the shadows. The clouds had opened by the time he reached Lillian's ranch, releasing fat, wet flakes that stuck to his coat and hat. He stamped the snow from his boots on her porch, then stepped inside. The kitchen was warm from the cook stove, and Lillian sat at her table mending by lamplight. "They're both alive and together," he reported, his voice rough. "But Annie—" He trailed off, the words sticking in his throat. "What did she say?" Lillian set down her sewing, the same thing she said that first day. Dakota sank into a chair, his big frame making the wood creak. "Don't let them sell her. Those traitors, they're planning something. The hearing is just for show." Lillian's needle jabbed into the table. "The railroad's been buying up every piece of land they can get their hands on. They'll use any excuse, any legal trick they can find. Or illegal ones." Dakota's dark eyes fixed on the lamp flame. "That lease land is worth more than 2 orphan girls to them. Once they have custody, the girls will disappear, sent to some distant Christian home that exists only on paper. Or worse." "Dear God," Lillian pressed her hand to her mouth. "We can't let that happen." "No." Dakota stood, his decision made. "We can't, and we won't." He strode to the door and pulled it open, letting in a swirl of snowflakes. The storm had picked up strength, driving the snow nearly sideways now, perfect weather for covering tracks. "Where are you going?" Lillian asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "To find help." Dakota checked his gun belt, then pulled his coat closer. "There are still good men in this territory. Men who remember what justice means." "The storm!" Lillian started to protest. "We'll hide my trail." He paused in the doorway, looking back at her. "I made those girls a promise. I mean to keep it." Lillian nodded slowly. "I'll have fresh horses ready at dawn." The night passed with agonizing slowness. Dakota tried to rest, knowing he'd need his strength, but sleep proved impossible. He lay on his bedroll in the barn loft, listening to the wind howl through the cracks in the walls. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Annie's face at the jail window, saw Clara's small form bundled against her sister's chest. The same scene played over and over, like a nightmare he couldn't shake. When the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the gaps in the barn boards, Dakota was already up and moving. True to her word, Lillian had his horse saddled and waiting, along with a fresh mount in case he needed to switch. She'd packed provisions as well, bread, dried meat, coffee. The storm had blown itself out during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow. The sun rose into a crystal-clear sky, making the white landscape sparkle like diamond dust. It would be hard traveling, but Dakota had crossed worse country in worse weather. He mounted up, settling into the saddle with the ease of long practice. Lillian stood in the yard, wrapped in a heavy shawl against the morning cold. "God go with you," she said simply. Dakota touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then turned his horse toward the east. The animal's hooves broke through the crusty surface of the snow with each step, but underneath was solid ground. They would make good time, despite the conditions. He had promises to keep, and dawn was burning the sky behind him like a signal fire of hope. The winter sun hung low on the horizon as Dakota's horse picked its way through the last mile to the Apache agency. Snow had drifted against the weathered wooden buildings, and smoke curled from stone chimneys into the purple evening sky. A few Apache children played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the crisp air. Dakota dismounted stiffly, his muscles aching from the long ride. He led his horse to the hitching post, noting the oil lamp already burning in the agent's office window. Good. William Carter was known to work late, especially in winter when paperwork piled up like the snow outside. The office door creaked as Dakota entered, bringing a blast of cold air with him. William Carter looked up from his desk, recognition lighting his weathered face. "Dakota Gray Elk," he said, rising to shake hands. "It's been some time." "Too long, my friend." Dakota clasped the offered hand. The two men had worked together during Carter's Army days, building a respect that transcended the usual barriers between whites and Apaches. "Coffee?" Carter gestured to the pot warming on the potbelly stove. When Dakota nodded, he poured 2 tin cups full of the strong brew. "This isn't a social call," Dakota said, warming his hands around the cup. He told the story: the orphan girls, the crooked traders, the railroad scheme, and the corrupt sheriff. Carter listened without interrupting, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Dakota finished, Carter set down his cup with deliberate care. "The lease was never transferable," he said. "Not without agency approval. I have the original documents in the safe. Your friend's father signed them himself." "Would you testify to that?" Dakota leaned forward. "In front of a judge?" "I'll do better than testify." Carter stood and crossed to the iron safe in the corner. "I'll bring the certified papers myself. The railroad's claim won't be worth the paper it's written on." Relief loosened the knot in Dakota's chest. Finally, a real chance to help those girls. "When can you ride?" "First light." Carter pulled papers from the safe, checking them by lamplight. "We'll need a witness to present these properly." "I know just the man, Thomas Running Bear. He was there when we drew up the original lease." "The girls don't have much time," Dakota warned. "The traders are pushing for a quick hearing." "Then we'd best get some rest." Carter carefully stored the papers in his desk. "You can bed down in the bunkhouse tonight. I'll have fresh horses ready at dawn." Dakota nodded his thanks, drinking the last of his coffee. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the world still and cold under a rising moon. In the bunkhouse, he lay awake for a long time, planning their next move. When sleep finally came, it was deep and dreamless. The first hint of gray touched the eastern sky when Dakota rose, ready to ride back and face whatever waited at the county seat. The winter sun climbed high as Dakota and William Carter pressed their horses through the deepening snow. Flurries swirled around them, coating their coats with a fine powder that melted and froze again. Their breath came out in white puffs, matching the rhythm of their horses' hooves crunching through the crusty drifts. "3 more hours to the McPherson Ranch," Carter called over his shoulder, adjusting his scarf against the biting wind. "Good folk there. They'll have fresh mounts waiting." Dakota nodded, his eyes scanning the white blanketed hills. The leather bag containing their precious documents was secured